the different Gospels and stuff that people are quite familiar with. Half the time, they didn't even need to read the subtitles. They could look at it and know what was going on.
What if the face you've been picturing in your head for your entire life, the soft eyes, the flowing hair, the gentle expression, isn't the Jesus that early Christians actually wrote about? For most of the Western world, the image of Christ was shaped less by Scripture and more by Renaissance painters working 1,000 years after the fact. Pale skin, calm eyes, a quiet, approachable figure who hangs in cathedrals and living rooms and children's books. That image is so familiar it barely registers as a choice anymore. It just feels like what Jesus looked like. But high in the mountains of Ethiopia, inside monasteries so remote that monks still climb ropes and cliff faces to reach them, a very different textual tradition has survived for over 1,000 years. A tradition that describes Christ not as gentle and soft-spoken, but as overwhelming. A being of blinding light whose voice shakes the natural world, whose presence angels can barely endure. Reports have circulated that filmmaker Mel Gibson, known for The Passion of the Christ and his long-rumored Resurrection sequel, has been looking into Ethiopian Christian sources as part of his research. We can't verify exactly what Gibson has said in private, and you should treat any specific quotes attributed to him with real skepticism until he says them on the record himself. Secondhand, he allegedly said quotes are exactly the kind of thing that spreads online without ever being confirmed. But his reported interest is a useful doorway into something that's genuinely fascinating on its own, independent of any celebrity attached to it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church's scriptural canon, and how differently it renders the figure of Christ compared to the Bible most Western readers grew up with. Today, we're going inside that tradition, in more depth than most documentaries bother to go. We'll look at the texts that never made it into the Western Bible, the manuscripts that predate large portions of the New Testament, the reasons historians actually give for why some of this material got left out of the canon most of the world eventually inherited, and what it's like inside the monasteries that kept it alive. By the end, you may find yourself looking at that painting on the wall a little differently, not because of a secret conspiracy, but because of a history most people were simply never taught. Here's something most Christians never learn in Sunday school. The Bible in their hands is not the only Bible that exists, and it was never the only one. The Protestant canon has 66 books. The Catholic canon has 73, including the deuterocanonical books like Tobit and Maccabees that Protestants set aside during the Reformation. The Eastern Orthodox churches include a handful of additional texts depending on the tradition. And then there's the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which recognizes a broader canon still, commonly cited as 81 books, with some counts running even higher depending on how certain texts are grouped, and whether you're counting the narrower or broader canon used in different Ethiopian liturgical contexts. That means there are entire books that early Christian communities read, quoted, and treated as scripture that most Western believers have never even heard of, let alone read. The Ethiopian canon includes the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Ascension of Isaiah, and the books of Maccabean, which, despite the similar name, are not the same as the books of Maccabees found in Catholic Bibles, among others. Several of these texts survive in complete form only in Ge'ez, Ethiopia's ancient liturgical language, which is still used in Ethiopian Orthodox worship today, much the way Latin persists in some Catholic liturgy. That's a significant detail, because it means these aren't just extra books. For some of them, Ethiopia is the only place on earth where the full text survived at all. Fragments and partial versions turn up elsewhere in Greek, Aramaic, and later in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the complete text, preserved and actively used in worship for well over 1,000 years, exists because of Ethiopian scribes. Ge'ez became a major Christian literary language remarkably early, developing its own script and its own translation tradition centuries before many European vernaculars had a Christian literature of their own. While parts of post-Roman Europe were struggling through the disruption of the 5th and 6th centuries, losing infrastructure, losing literacy rates, losing entire libraries to war and neglect, Ethiopian scribes were copying and recopying these manuscripts in highland monasteries that outside armies rarely reached. Geography did a lot of the preservation work here. Ethiopia's highland terrain is difficult to invade, and was for long stretches of its history difficult even to reach by trade routes that touch the rest of the Mediterranean world. The crown jewel of this tradition is the Gerima Gospels, a pair of illuminated gospel manuscripts housed at the Abba Garima Monastery in Tigray, in Ethiopia's north. According to local tradition, the manuscripts are associated with Abba Garima, one of the 9 saints credited with strengthening Christianity in the Aksumite kingdom in the 5th and 6th centuries. Radiocarbon testing conducted at Oxford's Research Laboratory for Archaeology dated the manuscripts to somewhere between the 4th and 7th centuries AD, a range that, if accurate, would make them among the oldest surviving illuminated Christian manuscripts in the world, older than many manuscripts held in European collections that get far more attention. They were written on parchment, decorated with pigments made from local minerals and plants, bound in wooden covers, by monks who saw themselves as custodians of something sacred, rather than as artists producing a commercial object. And they were right to treat the work that seriously, because while political and religious councils elsewhere were deciding which texts counted as scripture and which didn't, these manuscripts simply kept being copied, generation after generation, largely untouched by those debates happening in Rome, Constantinople, and later Geneva and Wittenberg. So what's actually in them, and in the wider tradition around them? The Ethiopian textual tradition, especially texts like the Book of Enoch and the Ascension of Isaiah, doesn't linger on the gentle, approachable Jesus that later Western art popularized. Instead, these texts, several written before or around the time of the New Testament, describe an overwhelming, almost cosmic figure. Hair white like wool. A face too bright to look at directly. A presence that terrifies before it comforts. This is not the Jesus who quietly blesses children in a stained glass window. This is closer to the Jesus of Revelation's 1st chapter, if you've ever actually sat down and read it slowly instead of skimming past it. Eyes like fire, a voice like the roar of many waters, a face like the sun shining in full strength. So overwhelming that John says he fell at his feet as though dead. This matters because of the timing. The Book of Enoch, portions of which, particularly the section scholars call the Book of the Watchers, are dated as early as the 3rd century BCE, describes a coming figure called the Son of Man and the Elect One, in language that is strikingly close to how the Book of Revelation, written centuries later, describes the risen Christ. Compare Enoch's description of a figure with a head of days and hair white like wool to Revelation 1:14, where Christ is described the same way, hair white like wool, eyes like a flame of fire. Both texts describe feet like polished bronze. Both describe an overwhelming voice. These aren't identical documents, and nobody is claiming John copied Enoch line for line. But the imagery clearly comes from the same well of apocalyptic Jewish and early Christian tradition, a shared visual vocabulary for describing divine judgment figures, and Enoch got there first by centuries. This isn't fringe trivia confined to obscure academic journals. The Book of Enoch was widely circulated in Second Temple Judaism. Fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, confirming it was in active use by Jewish communities in the centuries before Christ. And the New Testament itself acknowledges it directly. The Epistle of Jude, verses 14 and 15, quotes Enoch's prophecy almost word for word. Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all. Jude doesn't hedge this with, as an old legend says, he cites it the way you'd cite Scripture, attributing the words to Enoch, the seventh from Adam. Early church fathers were divided on what to do with that. Tertullian, writing in North Africa around 200 AD, defended Enoch's authority and argued it should be read as genuine prophecy. Other early Christian writers were more cautious. By the time of Augustine in the early 5th century, mainstream Latin Christianity had largely set Enoch aside, partly over authorship questions. Nobody seriously believed it was written by the biblical Enoch himself, 7 generations from Adam, and partly because of theological content, particularly its elaborate stories about fallen angels intermarrying with human women, which made some church leaders uncomfortable. The text didn't vanish because nobody read it or valued it. It was actively debated, cited, defended, and eventually set aside over the course of several centuries, a much messier and more human process than the church erased it. Beyond Enoch, Ethiopian Christian literature, including later theological and liturgical writings that developed within the Ethiopian church over centuries, carries its own distinct emphases that differ from a lot of mainstream Western theology. One recurring theme is the idea that human beings carry an inner spark of the divine, and that spiritual awakening, not just external ritual, is central to the Christian life. This isn't unique to Ethiopian Christianity. You can find related threads in early Christian mysticism, in certain texts labeled Gnostic by later heresiologists, and prominently in Eastern Orthodox theology's concept of theosis, the idea that the purpose of human life is to be progressively transformed into likeness with God, partakers of the divine nature, as 2 Peter 4 puts it. But it's a strand of thought that got somewhat sidelined in a lot of Western Christian teaching, particularly post-Reformation traditions that put heavy emphasis on human depravity and justification through faith alone, with less room for language about human beings sharing directly in divine nature. It's worth being honest here, the same way we were in the shorter version of this script. There isn't a verified ancient Ethiopian manuscript containing an exact line like, "You are not children of dust, but children of light," presented as a direct, sourced quotation from Jesus. Passages like that circulate widely online, often without any clear textual citation attached, and they should be treated as unverified rather than as documented scripture, however evocative they sound. What is well documented in actual scholarship on Ethiopian Christianity is that the tradition developed a genuine and distinct theological emphasis on inner spiritual transformation, shaped by centuries of relative independence from Roman and Byzantine church politics, and that emphasis really is underrepresented in how most Western Christians learn their own religious history. You don't need invented quotes to make that point. The real theological history is interesting enough on its own. One of the most theologically striking texts preserved in the Ethiopian canon is the Ascension of Isaiah, which scholars generally date to the late 1st or early 2nd century AD, meaning it's roughly contemporary with, or possibly even earlier than, some of the latest written New Testament documents. Portions of it exist in Greek, Latin, and Slavonic fragments, but the complete text survives only in gaze. The text describes the prophet Isaiah being taken on a vision through 7 layered heavens, each populated by different classes of angelic beings, and each closer to the presence of God than the last. It's structured almost like a travel narrative through increasingly rarefied territory. In the lower heavens, Isaiah witnesses conflict, angelic beings recording the deeds of people on earth, struggles between good and evil that mirror what happens below. As he ascends, the beings grow more radiant, and the conflict falls away, replaced by pure worship. By the sixth and seventh heavens, Isaiah witnesses beings of overwhelming glory who worship a figure called the Beloved, understood in the text as Christ, existing in radiant pre-incarnate form, seated in glory before his descent into human history. The text then describes Christ's descent through each heavenly level on his way to earth, adjusting his appearance at each stage so that the beings there can perceive him without being destroyed by the encounter. A theological way of expressing the idea that the infinite God became small enough to enter human history without anyone in the lower realms fully recognizing who they were looking at. In the account, Christ descends unrecognized all the way down to his birth as an ordinary infant in Bethlehem, where, in a detail that shows up in a few early Christian sources beyond just this text, even Mary's pregnancy is described as astonishingly free of the visible signs one would expect, as though the ordinary rules of the physical world were quietly suspended around the event without anyone noticing. It's a genuinely striking piece of early Christian cosmology, one that few Western Christians have ever encountered, because it was never part of the canon that shaped Catholic or Protestant tradition, and because after the 4th or 5th century it largely dropped out of circulation outside Ethiopia and a handful of scattered manuscript fragments elsewhere. So, why isn't any of this in the Bible most people grew up reading? The honest answer isn't a single dramatic cover-up orchestrated by one council on one afternoon. It's a centuries-long, genuinely messy process of different church communities spread across a huge geographic area with limited communication, disagreeing about which texts counted as authoritative scripture. After Christianity became first tolerated and then the favored, and eventually the state religion of the Roman Empire over the course of the 4th century, church councils and influential bishops increasingly worked to standardize doctrine and scripture across a sprawling, culturally diverse religious movement that stretched from Britain to Persia. Texts that were widely read and trusted in one region weren't necessarily accepted, or even known, in another. There was no single moment where someone sat down with a master list and crossed out the dangerous books. The Council of Laodicea, held sometime in the mid to late 4th century, is often cited as one of the early moments when a more restricted list of accepted books began to take shape in parts of the Western and Eastern Mediterranean Church, though the process of canon formation continued for centuries afterward, played out differently in different regions, and wasn't formally and definitively settled for the Catholic Church until the Council of Trent in the 16th century, over 1,000 years later, and largely in reaction to the Protestant Reformation's own canon debates. Texts like Enoch and the Ascension of Isaiah fell out of favor in the Latin and Greek-speaking churches for a mix of overlapping reasons: uncertainty and disagreement about authorship, genuine theological disputes about content that some bishops found troubling or speculative, and, in some cases, real discomfort with how these texts seem to grant visionary authority to individual prophets and seers, rather than routing revelation exclusively through recognized apostolic and institutional channels. It's fair to say, and plenty of legitimate historians would agree, that texts emphasizing direct, unmediated spiritual experience were less useful to institutions that were actively consolidating doctrinal and administrative authority across a huge empire. But it's an overstatement, the kind that makes for a dramatic YouTube script but doesn't hold up well under scrutiny, to frame this purely as a deliberate, centralized conspiracy to suppress the true Jesus. Canon formation was contested, regional, slow, and driven by real theological disagreement among sincere believers as much as by institutional politics and power consolidation. Ethiopia, meanwhile, was geographically and politically separated from most of these debates almost by accident of geography. The kingdom of Aksum adopted Christianity in the 4th century under King Ezana, making it one of the earliest Christian states in the world, earlier than most of Europe, and among the first nations anywhere to adopt Christianity as a state religion. When Islam spread rapidly across North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, Ethiopia became increasingly isolated from the theological centers of Rome and Constantinople, cut off by both distance and by newly Muslim-controlled territory in between. Its church simply continued using the broader canon and the theological emphases it had already inherited from its early formative centuries, largely undisturbed by councils and doctrinal shifts happening thousands of miles away in a different linguistic and political world entirely. What followed was over 1,000 years of quiet, painstaking preservation, carried out by generations of people whose names mostly aren't recorded anywhere. In highland scriptoria lit by oil lamps, monks copied manuscripts by hand onto parchment made from treated animal skin, mixing their own inks from soot, minerals, and plant extracts, ruling lines onto the page by hand before a single letter was written. This was slow, physically brutal work, the kind that damaged eyesight over years of close labor by dim light and bent spines from hunching over a writing table for hours at a stretch. And it's the entire reason these texts exist today at all, rather than existing only as scattered fragments in a museum collection. That work wasn't confined to some distant romanticized past either. During the Tigray conflict that began in November 2020, the Gerima Gospels came under real and immediate threat as fighting reached the region around Abba Garima Monastery. Local monks and clergy took urgent steps to protect the manuscripts as the conflict approached, moving them to safety rather than risk their destruction or loss, a modern, documented echo of exactly the kind of preservation effort that has kept these texts alive since late antiquity. It's a reminder that this isn't purely academic history. It's a living tradition that people in Ethiopia were actively risking themselves to protect within the last few years. None of this requires believing in a hidden conspiracy to find how genuinely different and genuinely old this material is, or to think it deserves more attention than it usually gets. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition preserves some of the earliest surviving Christian art and text in the world, full stop, regardless of how you feel about any particular theological claim inside it. Its portrait of Christ, shaped by centuries of relative independence from Roman and Byzantine theological development, really does emphasize awe, cosmic scale, and radiant power in ways that got softened out of a lot of later Western religious art, which increasingly favored intimacy and approachability over overwhelming majesty as its dominant visual mode. Icons in Ethiopian churches today still show Christ, often called Exhiabher, Lord of the Universe, with dark skin, large penetrating eyes, and rays of light radiating outward, a genuinely different visual and theological language than the pale, gentle Christ familiar from European painting traditions that came to dominate global Christian imagery through sheer economic and colonial reach, rather than through any theological argument for their accuracy. If Mel Gibson really is drawing on Ethiopian Christian sources for a future project, that's a legitimate and interesting creative choice. This is a rich, underexplored textual tradition that most audiences have genuinely never been exposed to, and there's a lot of dramatic, visually striking material here for a filmmaker to work with. But it's worth engaging with the actual texts and the actual scholarship, rather than second-hand quotes and dramatized claims that can't be traced back to a verifiable source. The Book of Enoch, the Ascension of Isaiah, and the broader Ethiopian canon don't need embellishment to be remarkable. They're already among the oldest surviving windows into how early Christians imagined the figure at the center of their faith, preserved through 1,000 years of dedicated, largely anonymous labor in a part of the world that rarely gets credit for it, and that's a story worth telling accurately without needing to invent quotes to make it land.